Well, what happened is that the Zionists leaders, some of them in Britain, a man named Chaim Weizmann, who is quite well known, went to the British government and said, well, we can help you win this war. Now, why would they want to do that? Because the war wasn't just against Germany, it was against the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire held Palestine. Palestine was under the Ottoman Empire. So by defeating them, the British would come into control of Palestine. So the Zionists went to the British and said, we can help you get the United States into the war. Our Zionist colleagues in the United States, for example, they said in writing, Louis Brandeis, who is close to President Wilson, can help to do that. In exchange for that, the British did issue a declaration that was quite significant, mild as it may sound. It was really considered a gentleman's agreement. This is written about in a number of books. Just most of us don't know this about our own history. So the Balfour Declaration was basically a promise that the British would help to facilitate the Zionist objective of creating a Jewish state in Palestine. After the British, of course, did win, then at the Paris peace talks, the Zionists pushed this wording into the mandate in which Britain took charge. Then we find during the 30s and the 40s, in Palestine itself, there were the violence increased. Naturally, as soon, when there was colonization beginning around the turn of the century to a land with the intention of pushing out the land, the indigenous population at some point is going to wake up, and there will be violence. That had happened in the early 20s, and again in 1929. There was violence between the two populations. Then as now, the large number of those killed were the Palestinians. So as the violence increased, there were some terrorist organizations created in Palestine by the Zionists. One of them led by in fact, two of them led by future Israeli prime ministers. And those terrorist organizations in Palestine, the Irgun and the Stern Gang, it turns out had front groups in the United States with duplicitous names. And they were funneling massive amounts of money and weaponry to these terror groups in Palestine. They put on major pageants where Supreme Court justices attended and thousands of people attended. They were very prominent. One of them was led by a man named Peter Bergson, people thought. His real name was Hillel Cook. He was the operative for the Irgun. I looked into one of the leaders a bit more, just because I needed to find out his first name. And I'd heard about another leader of one of these types of front groups connected to killing in Palestine. And his name was Rabbi Korf, but I didn't know the first name. So I looked into it on the internet, tried to do various searches, and eventually I came up with a UN report that gave his first name, Baruch Korf, and told a little bit about a plot he was part of. It turned out that Rabbi Baruch Korf was part of a cell in Paris that was planning to fly an airplane and bomb Britain after the war. Britain that had just defeated Hitler. But they were so angry at the British because the British were not allowing a large enough Jewish immigration into Palestine. So they were going to kill the British. So Baruch Korf and his section of the Stern Gang had this plan, but there was one problem. They didn't know how to fly an airplane. They weren't pilots. So they needed to find somebody, and they recruited a young American aviator named Reginald Gilbert, I discovered. Reginald Gilbert had been an ace during the war. He was in Paris, and they recruited him to fly the airplane for them. He pretended to go along with the plot, but then he went to the American embassy. And the American embassy informed the Paris police and Scotland Yard. So for a week, he pretended to go along with this cell. And then when it came time to actually take off, to fly the plane, to drop these incendiary bombs onto the foreign ministry, they were caught. By the way, the original plan had been to bomb Parliament, but then they decided they hated the foreign ministry more. And Gilbert at one point had said to them, well, what if I can't find the foreign ministry in the London fog? And they said, then just drop them anywhere. Kill anybody. All British are our enemy. So they were caught. Korff was in prison for a few months in Paris, and he eventually got off. He had very powerful friends in the United States. And so in looking at him, I discovered that later in life, he was a friend of Richard Nixon. In fact, it was reported that he had helped to influence Nixon's policies on the Middle East. In fact, Nixon, sort of in a fond way, called him my rabbi. Now, the precursor to today's very powerful Israel lobby was a group called the American Zionist Emergency Council, AZEC. This was formed in around 1940, and by 1943 had a budget of $500,000 at a time when a nickel bought a loaf of bread. Within a few years, they had maneuvered their way into access to an even far larger sum, in which they had access to $14 million in 1941 and $150 million by 1948. That's the equivalent in today's dollars of $1 trillion to use to manipulate the United States. So they targeted, with that money, every sector of U.S. society. And this isn't ancient history. They had annual reports, they had directives, all of this was written down on paper. They targeted congressmen, Christian clergy, editors, professors, business and labor, Jewish war veterans. They published books all over. They had 400 local committees. There were massive campaigns throughout the country. They also worked especially to manufacture Christian support. They secretly funded sort of Christian groups that would push the same Zionist ideology. They funded books that became huge bestsellers. It was an enormously successful campaign throughout the country. Even though during this time there was a great deal of opposition to Zionism by many different groups, by Christian leaders, by State Department, Pentagon, intelligence agencies, Jewish anti-Zionists, many people were opposed to it. Two of the most celebrated Christian pastors opposed it on religious and moral grounds. The Christian leaders in the Middle East had gone to the Paris peace talks to advocate on behalf of the Arab population that there should be self-determination of peoples there. One very prominent American Christian who was a Dead Sea scholar wrote a wonderful book called Palestine is Our Issue, is Our Business. He talks about the right of return, about Palestinian resistance fighters, etc. But it was buried. Diplomats, the State Department, the military, the Pentagon, the intelligence agencies wrote directive after directive, study after study, memo after memo, talking about how damaging to the U.S. and to U.S. strategic interests and how in violation of American principles Zionism would be. Starting from under Taft, there was then a commission to Palestine during the time of the Paris peace talks. They went there to investigate the situation, to look into the possibility of creating a Jewish state there. And they came back with a very powerful report saying this would be a grave trespass on the rights of the people there. This was entirely buried and had no effect whatsoever. Dean Acheson, a major statesman for many years, wrote that the Zionist agenda would imperil not only American but all Western interests in the Near East. The CIA wrote that they were pursuing objectives that would endanger the strategic interests of the Western powers in the Near and Middle East. There's so much evidence of this. Some people debate about whether the lobby is powerful. It's been powerful since the beginning, and the evidence is all there. It's just buried. Alfred Lilienthal was part of the American Council for Judaism. I had the honor of meeting him. He wrote excellent books about this. That group was arguing against Zionism. And part of what they were arguing in the State Department was that there would be massive bloodshed and chaos if this was pushed through. When the Zionists began to work to push through what's called the partition plan through the United Nations, that's portrayed to Americans as this wonderful compromise. And the State Department were saying this would be a disaster if this gets pushed through. The idea was that that Palestine, half of it would be given to a Jewish state. Even though these were mostly recently arrived and had originally only been 5% of the population. And even after decades of immigration, were 30% of the population. And this plan wasn't actually half. The plan was that they would get 55% of Palestine approximately, and the Palestinians would get about 45% of their own land. Now, I know what the Americans would say if the UN did that to us, but this is portrayed with, oh, those foolish Palestinians not accepting that. And by the way, many people are under the illusion that Israel bought up all that land. That's what's been told, and that was the attempt. And they did increase Jewish ownership from what was originally about 1%, because it was an urban population, to at most 8%. Most historians said they owned about 5 to 6%. So a group that owned 8% under this plan was getting 55%, a good deal for them. No wonder they said they would go along with it, and secretly in their journal said it's the first step, then we will get it all. But rather than bringing peace, which was what the UN was charged with, instead of bringing peace, it did the opposite. It created, of course, still more violence, and there was a war that Israel calls its War of Independence, and Palestinians call it al-Nakba, the catastrophe, because it was a massive humanitarian catastrophe. At least 750,000 men, women, and children were very ruthlessly and violently pushed off their land. There were at least 16 massacres before a single Arab army finally joined the fray. And by the way, those of you that grew up with the myth that I did, that little Israel declared its independence and suddenly, 5 to 7 Arab armies suddenly just attacked, but Israel somehow won because God, was on their side or something. Well, in reality, before Israel declared its independence on about May 14th, 15th, it's a midnight type of situation, they had already committed 16 massacres. These are quite grisly. You can read the details of them. They had already ethnically cleansed at least 200,000 people. When these Arab armies did come into the fray, they were smaller in number, including the Palestinian forces, than the Zionist forces were. And by the way, virtually all of the battles were actually fought on the part that, according to the UN plan, was going to be Palestinian territory.